The coffee hit him right between the eyes. Not metaphorically, not in some poetic, slow-motion kind of way. Literally, hot, black, fresh brewed coffee, the kind that burns, flew across that marble countertop and splashed directly onto the face of a man worth $4.7 billion. And the whole diner went silent. Every fork stopped moving. Every conversation died. Even the cook in the back, a big man named Gerald who had seen everything in 30 years of short-order cooking, leaned to the pickup window just to stare. Because standing on one side of that counter was Marcus Cole, 41 years old, founder of Cole Industries, owner of 3 private jets, a penthouse in Manhattan, and a reputation for never losing. And standing on the other side was a woman in a stained yellow apron, a ponytail coming loose, mascara slightly smudged under her left eye, holding an empty coffee mug like it was a weapon she was fully prepared to use again. Her hand was shaking, but her eyes were not, and tucked inside the pocket of that apron, still warm from being held too tightly, was a pregnancy test. Positive. Nobody in that diner knew what had just happened between these two people. Nobody knew that 6 hours earlier she had been fired from the job she'd held for 3 years. Nobody knew that 2 hours after that she had been sitting in a gas station bathroom, staring at 2 pink lines that changed everything. Nobody knew that in a moment of panic, hands trembling, vision blurred with tears, she had grabbed her phone to text her sister and sent the photo to the wrong number. Nobody knew that the wrong number belonged to him. And nobody in that diner could have imagined what he had said when he walked through that door, looked her in the eye, and opened his mouth. But she heard it, and that's why the coffee flew. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who loves a story that grabs you by the heart and does not let go, do yourself a favor right now. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs a good story tonight. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from, because this community is everywhere, and we love knowing you are here. Now, let's go back to the moment that started all of this. Let's go back to the morning everything fell apart. It started, like most bad days do, with something small. A crack in the ceiling. Maggie Calloway had been staring at that crack for 11 months. It started above the window in her bedroom, thin as a thread, and over time it spread like a river on a map, branching out toward the corner, splitting into smaller lines, a whole geography of damage right above her head. She kept meaning to call the landlord. She kept forgetting. Or maybe she kept not calling, because calling meant one more problem to solve, one more conversation where she would be asked for something she did not have. She was 29 years old, and she was tired in a way that sleep did not fix. She had been tired like this for about 3 years, since her mother got sick, since the hospital bills started, since her younger sister Danny moved back to Ohio for a job, and Maggie stayed in New York, because the thought of starting over in a new city on top of everything else was just one thing too many. She got up at 5:45 every morning, made coffee in a pot that took 10 minutes to brew because the heating element was going, made toast, got dressed in the dark so she would not wake her neighbor's baby through the thin wall between their apartments, walked 6 blocks to the bus stop, took the 47 downtown, walked another 3 blocks to the Sunside Diner on West 38th Street, where she had worked as a waitress for 3 years and 2 months and 4 days. She liked the diner. That was the honest truth. She liked Gerald's cooking. She liked the regulars. Mr. Fitch, who came in every Tuesday for French toast and always left exactly a $4 tip, no more, no less, and somehow that reliability felt like something she could count on. She liked her manager, Patrice, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses always perched on her head, and a laugh you could hear from across the street. She had built something small and functional there. It was not glamorous, but it was hers. The morning she lost its start like any other morning. She came into the back at 6:50, 10 minutes early like always, hung her coat on the hook by the storage room, tied her apron, pulled her hair back. The breakfast rush started at 7, and by 7:15 the place was full. Truckers and construction workers and office people grabbing egg sandwiches before their commute, tourists with luggage by their feet studying paper maps, a table of elderly women who met every Thursday and always ordered the same things, and always stayed too long, and always left generous tips because they remembered what it felt like to need them. Maggie moved through all of it the way she always did, efficient, friendly without being fake about it. She remembered orders. She remembered faces. She remembered that the man in booth 4 took his coffee with exactly 1 sugar and got annoyed if you brought 2 packets. She remembered that the woman by the window was lactose intolerant and always forgot to ask for oat milk until after the drink arrived. Small things. She was good at small things. Around 9:30, when the rush slowed and the place emptied out to a handful of lingering tables, Patrice came out of the back office with a look on her face that Maggie had never seen before. Not angry. Worse than angry. Uncomfortable. Patrice had been managing the Sunside Diner for 11 years. She had fired people before. A dishwasher who stole from the register. A cook who showed up drunk. A waitress who was consistently rude to customers. She had always done it directly and without drama because she was a direct, no-drama kind of woman. But this was different. Maggie could tell. Because Patrice would not quite meet her eyes. She asked Maggie to come to the back. They stood in the narrow hallway between the storage room and the office, fluorescent light humming above them, the smell of bleach and fry oil in the air, and Patrice told her. The diner had been bought. Not just the diner. The building. The whole block, actually. A real estate acquisition that had happened quietly through a series of holding companies, and the sale had been finalized 3 days ago. The new owner had sent a representative that morning, a woman in a blazer who had walked through the dining room with a clipboard while Maggie was refilling coffee, and not said a word, and that representative had delivered a directive. New ownership was restructuring. The diner would continue operating under new management. All current staff were being let go effective immediately, with 2-week severance. Patrice delivered all of this in a careful, measured tone. Then her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last part. She was being let go, too. Maggie stood there for a moment. She thought about the crack in her ceiling. She thought about the heating element in her coffee pot. She thought about her mother's medical bills, which she still had $14,000 left on from a payment plan she had set up at the hospital 18 months ago. She thought about her rent, which was due in 12 days. She said, "Okay." Patrice said she was sorry. She said it like she meant it. Maggie untied her apron, hung it on the hook, got her coat, walked out through the back door. She stood on the sidewalk in the October cold and looked up at the sky and thought, now what? She did not cry. Not then. She had learned a long time ago to save crying for later, for somewhere private, because crying in public used up energy she needed for other things. She stood there for a minute, and she made a list in her head, the way she always did when things went wrong. Okay, 2 weeks severance. That covers rent if she was careful. She could file for unemployment today. Get that started. She could call the cafe on 45th that had a help wanted sign in the window. She could call the temp agency she had used years ago. She could call Danny, not ask for money, just to talk, just to hear a voice. She started walking. No particular direction at first, just moving, because standing still made the panic rise faster. She walked 6 blocks before she realized she needed to use a restroom. There was a gas station on the corner of 38th and 9th. She had been in there before for gum and cold medicine. She went in, nodded at the guy behind the counter, who barely looked up, went to the back. The bathroom was the kind that required a key attached to a large plastic fob to prevent theft of the key, which always struck Maggie as absurd, as though someone was going to steal a gas station bathroom key as a prize. She used it, washed her hands, was about to leave, and then she stopped. She stood in front of the mirror for a moment and did the math that she had been refusing to do for about 3 weeks. Her period was late, 23 days late. She had told herself it was stress, and there had been plenty of stress. Her mother's follow-up appointments, a particularly bad week with the tips, trouble sleeping. Stress could do that. She knew it could. She had looked it up. Stress could absolutely delay a cycle. That was science. But she had also been avoiding the other possibility with the specific, deliberate energy of someone who knows exactly what they are avoiding and why. There was a display rack by the register with various drugstore items. She had walked past it 100 times. She walked back out to front, bought a pregnancy test with 11 of the $14 she had in her wallet at that moment, and went back to the bathroom. She stood there for 3 minutes, which is how long the instructions said to wait, and she looked at the ceiling, which did not have a crack in it, and she thought about absolutely nothing at all with the forced blankness of someone holding a scream inside their chest. Then she looked down. 2 lines. Pink. Clear. Unmistakable. She sat down on the edge of the sink because her legs wanted to give out, and she would not let them, not entirely. So she compromised with the sink. She sat there for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. She needed to call Danny. Danny was the person she called when things were impossible. Danny would know what to say, or she would not know what to say, but she would say something warm, and it would help. But her hands were shaking, and her vision was blurred, and she was not looking carefully at the screen. And instead of pressing Danny's name in her contacts, she pressed a number she had texted just once before. 3 months ago, a wrong number situation that had been quickly sorted out. A brief exchange where she had texted asking about a plumber's appointment, and a man had responded saying, "You have the wrong number," and she had said sorry, and that had been the end of it. She did not remember saving the number, but apparently she had. She took a photo of the pregnancy test, still sitting on the sink, still barely thinking, still operating on pure shock and autopilot. She texted it to Danny with the message, "I don't know what to do," except it was not Danny. She put her phone in her pocket and sat there for another 10 minutes. Then she stood up, washed her face, put the test back in her pocket because she did not know what else to do with it, and walked out. She did not look at her phone for 2 hours. Marcus Cole had been awake since 4:30. This was not unusual. Marcus Cole was almost always awake before 5. He had read once that most highly productive executives were early risers, and he had been skeptical of that. He suspected it was a narrative people told themselves to feel superior about their sleep deprivation, but for him it was simply true. His brain started firing around 4:30, whether he wanted it to or not, and fighting it was useless. So years ago he had stopped fighting it and simply gotten up. His mornings had a rhythm. Coffee, black, made in a machine that cost more than most people's rent. 40 minutes on the treadmill while reading through his overnight emails. A shower. A specific breakfast. Eggs, turkey, black beans, no bread. Prepared by a housekeeper named Mrs. Avila who had worked for him for 6 years and was the most quietly competent person he had ever met. Then the car to the office. He ran his days the way he ran his business. Precisely, efficiently, with a preference for decisions made quickly and completely. No lingering, no revisiting. Forward motion always. Cole Industries was a real estate and development company that he had built from nothing. Truly from nothing. Not from a small loan or a family connection or a safety net of any kind, but from a single apartment building in the South Bronx that he had bought at 23 with every dollar he had saved from 5 years of working 2 jobs. A fact that he almost never mentioned publicly because he had found that people did not entirely believe it, or if they believed it, they turned it into a motivational story that made him uncomfortable, as though poverty was an achievement rather than a circumstance he had survived. He did not romanticize where he came from. He also did not pretend it had not happened. He simply moved forward. That was the only thing he knew how to do. By 9 that morning, he was in his office on the 42nd floor of the Cole Industries building on 6th Avenue, which had floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city that still, after 7 years of working there, occasionally stopped a mid-thought when the light hit it a certain way. His assistant, James, had briefed him on the West Side block acquisition, which had finalized over the weekend. The block included 4 commercial properties, 2 of which were currently operating as a restaurant and a diner respectively. Both leases had expired. The plan was a ground-up redevelopment, mixed use, residential above, retail below, the kind of project that would take 3 years and generate conservatively 8 times the acquisition cost. It was a straightforward deal. He had done hundreds like it. The tenants would receive standard severance arrangements, relocation assistance for the restaurant, which had a longer operating history. It was handled. He had moved on to other things before 10. At 10:47 his phone buzzed. He was in the middle of reviewing a zoning document and did not pick it up immediately. When he did, he saw it was a text from a number he did not recognize. He almost dismissed it. Then he opened it. It was a photo of a pregnancy test. Positive. Below it, a message. "I don't know what to do." Marcus Cole stared at his phone for a long moment. He was not a man who stared at things. He was a man who looked at things, assessed them, and responded. But this required a different kind of moment. He scrolled up in the thread. The only previous exchange was from 3 months ago, a wrong number situation involving a plumber. He had told her wrong number. She had apologized. End of exchange. Which meant this was also a wrong number. This woman, whoever she was, had meant to send this to someone else. Someone close to her. Someone she trusted. She had sent it to him by accident. He thought about simply not responding. That was the logical thing. It was not his message. It was not his situation. He had a zoning document in front of him, and at 2 o'clock with his development team, and nothing about this was his business. He set the phone down, picked it up again 40 seconds later. He thought about what it would feel like to send something like that, a photo of a positive pregnancy test, and have no one respond. To be waiting for someone to say something, anything, and hear nothing. He typed, "I think you have the wrong number again. I'm not whoever you meant to send this to, but I hope you're okay." He sent it and put the phone down and went back to the zoning document. 30 seconds later, his phone buzzed again. "Oh my God. Oh no. I am so sorry. I'm so embarrassed. Please forget you saw that. I'm so sorry." He looked at the message. Then, without entirely understanding why, he typed, "Don't be embarrassed. Is there someone you can call?" There was a long pause. Then, "Yes. Sorry again." He went back to the zoning document. But for the rest of the morning, in a small, quiet corner of his attention that he could not quite shut off, he thought about that photo, 2 pink lines, and the message beneath it. "I don't know what to do." Maggie discovered the wrong number situation at a little past noon, sitting on a bench in a small pocket park on 34th Street, her coat pulled tight, the October air sharp. She scrolled up to figure out why her text had not received the warmly panicked Danny response she was expecting, and instead found herself reading a brief exchange with a stranger. Her face went hot, then hotter when she read the second message. "Is there someone you can call?" She stared at that message for a long time. It was such a careful thing to say, not dramatic, not uncomfortable, not ignoring it. Just, "Is there someone you can call?" She typed the apology and put her phone away and made herself take 3 slow breaths, and then called Danny for real this time, pressing her name carefully in the contact screen. Danny answered on the second ring. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Danny cycled through shock and concern and fierce love in a way that only a younger sibling who thinks of you as both a hero and her responsibility can do. She asked all the practical questions and all the emotional questions and said all the right things. She offered to come to New York. Maggie said no. She offered money. Maggie said no. She asked very carefully about the father. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said his name, which was Kevin, and Danny made a very specific sound that communicated, without any words at all, exactly what she thought about Kevin. Kevin was not in the picture. Kevin had not been in the picture for 2 months, since a conversation in his apartment where he had made very clear, in the particular way of a man who wants to seem reasonable while being unreasonable, that he was not interested in anything serious. He had said it like it was a gift, like he was doing her a kindness by clarifying. She had nodded and said she understood and gone home and never contacted him again, because she had too much dignity for most things, and certainly for that. Kevin did not know about the pregnancy test. Maggie had not decided what to do about that yet. Danny said she would call tomorrow. She said she loved her. She said Maggie was the strongest person she had ever known, which Maggie did not entirely believe, but which helped anyway. Maggie hung up and sat in the cold, and let herself feel everything she had been holding back all day. The transition. The diner, Sunside, had 12 current employees. All had been notified that morning. Severance packages were processing. Marcus read the summary. He looked at the diner's address. West 38th Street. He picked up his phone. Looked at the wrong number thread. It was probably a coincidence. New York was enormous. There were hundreds of diners. Thousands of people who got unexpected news and texted the wrong number on a bad day. He put the phone down, picked it up again. He pulled up the summary. The diner had been open for 14 years. The current staff included employees who had been there as long as 7 years. Severance was 2 weeks. Standard. Marcus had been doing this long enough to know that 2 weeks was not enough. He also knew that the deal was sound and the development was necessary, and the city needed housing more than it needed another diner on a block that could hold 200 apartments. He believed this. He had told himself this many times during many similar transactions. It did not always help. He pulled up his messages and typed, "This is going to sound strange, but I want to make sure you are actually okay. You don't have to respond." He stared at it for 30 seconds. Then he deleted it without sending and went to 4 o'clock. At 6:15 that evening, Maggie was back at the Sunside Diner. She had not planned to go back, but she had been walking past on her way to the pharmacy, and she saw the light on inside, just the kitchen light from the back, and the sign still in the window, which had not yet been changed, and she had stopped. The door was unlocked. Patrice was inside, sitting at the counter with a mug of coffee and a legal pad full of notes, her reading glasses on her nose, looking exhausted in the specific way of someone who has just spent a full day trying to figure out a problem they cannot solve. She looked up when Maggie came in. They sat together at the counter for an hour. Patrice was 61 years old. She had worked in this diner, in this building, for 11 years. She had a daughter in college. She had a mortgage on a small house in Queens. She was 15 years into paying. 2 weeks' severance was, she said quietly, not quite a full month's rent. Maggie listened. She brought Patrice a refill from the pot that was still warm. She thought about the holding company that had bought the building. She had looked it up on her phone that afternoon, following a chain of LLCs and subsidiaries until she hit something called Cole Capital Management, and then a few more clicks until she found the name Marcus Cole, and a photo of a man in a dark suit at some kind of opening event, looking at the camera with the particular expression of someone who is used to being photographed and has decided not to find it interesting. 41, founder and CEO of Cole Industries, net worth estimated at $4.7 billion. She had stared at the photo for a while. He looked. She tried to be objective about it. He looked like the kind of man who had made a decision a long time ago to not let things touch him. Sharp face, good jaw, something behind the eyes that might have been intelligence or might have been distance or might have been both. She closed the browser. She was not thinking about him. This was not about him. This was about Patrice and Gerald in the back, who had worked here 9 years and supported 2 kids in the Bronx, and Maria, who was the other full-time waitress, and sending money back to her mother in Puerto Rico, and the whole small, careful world of this diner that had been bought and sold without anyone in it being consulted. She told Patrice good night and walked home, and that night, for the first time in a long time, she cried in a way she could not control and could not stop, sitting on the floor of her bathroom with her back against the tub, until she was empty and exhausted and finally able to sleep. 3 days passed. Maggie filed for unemployment. She went to the cafe on 45th and applied for the waitress position, and was told they would call her, which was what they said when they were not going to call. She applied to 4 other places online. She texted Kevin, a single careful message, "There's something I need to talk to you about." He did not respond for 24 hours, and then said, "Can it wait? I'm slammed at work." And she typed back yes and stared at that word for a long time before sending it. She was 6 weeks pregnant, approximately. She had made an appointment at a clinic for an initial consultation, just for information, just to understand her options. The appointment was in 5 days. She was eating carefully. She had read everything she could find online about early pregnancy nutrition and had reorganized her grocery spending accordingly, spending less on things she normally bought and more on vegetables and protein, doing the math at the grocery store with her phone calculator to stay exactly within her budget. She was managing. This was what Maggie did. She managed. On the 3rd night, she could not sleep. She lay in the dark under the cracked ceiling and listened to buildings settle around her and counted her worries the way some people count sheep. Hospital bills, rent, Kevin, the job, the baby, Patrice, the cafe on 45th that had not called, the 4 online applications with no response. At 2 in the morning, she picked up her phone. She did not know why she went to the wrong number thread. Maybe because it was neutral ground, not Danny, who worried, not Patrice, who had her own crisis, not anyone in her actual life who would want something from this, who would have feelings about it that she would then have to manage on top of her own. She stared at the thread for a while. His last message, "Is there someone you can call?" She typed, not really thinking about it, like writing a diary. "I think I figured out who you are." She stared at it. Then, in a moment of exhaustion-fueled honesty that she would think about later and cringe at, "You bought my diner." She was about to put the phone down. Then she typed one more thing, just because she was tired and 2 in the morning and past caring about what she was supposed to do. "I'm not texting you because I want anything. I just wanted to know if the person who got a photo of my pregnancy test was the same person who accidentally ruined my life on the same day. It seemed like a thing worth knowing. She sent it and put the phone face down on her nightstand and closed her eyes. Her phone buzzed 40 seconds later. She stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked it up. Are you Maggie Calloway? Formerly of the Sunside Diner on West 38th? She sat up. How do you know my name? Your severance paperwork came across my desk today. I made the connection when you mentioned the diner. I owe you a conversation. Can you meet me tomorrow? She read that 3 times. Then she typed, no. A pause. Then why not? Because you're a billionaire, and I'm a pregnant waitress you accidentally fired, and it's 2 in the morning, and this whole situation is insane. Another pause. Longer this time. All of that is accurate. I'm still asking. She put the phone down, picked it up, put it down again, picked it up. Why? Because I want to understand your situation better, and because I think the severance arrangement is inadequate, and I'd like to address that. She stared at that message for a long time. Then she typed, Patrice has worked in that diner for 11 years. She has a daughter in college and a mortgage. Gerald has worked there 9 years. Maria has been there 7. 2 weeks is not enough. I know. Then why? Because it's standard. Because my team processed it as standard. Because I did not look at the individual circumstances of the employees involved. That was a mistake. She read that twice. Then, is this how you usually respond to angry texts from people you accidentally wronged? No. Then why now? A very long pause this time. I don't know. Meet me for coffee. She almost laughed. Almost. She was too tired to fully laugh. She typed, I work at a diner. Or I used to. I know what coffee actually costs, and I am not impressed by it as a gesture. Fair. Dinner then. She thought about it. About what Danny would say. About what the sensible thing was. About the fact that she was awake at 2 in the morning and had no job and was 6 weeks pregnant. And the man responsible for part of that was apparently awake at the same time texting her about severance packages. She typed, Gerald, Patrice, and Maria get their situations addressed first. Personally, not through a form. That's the condition. Deal. She put the phone down and lay in the dark and thought, what exactly is happening here? Marcus Cole's driver picked him up at his building on Central Park West at 7:30 the next morning. In the car. Before the day officially began, he sat with his coffee and his phone and thought about the conversation from 2 in the morning with the kind of clarity that comes from having had 4 hours to sleep on something. He had been awake when her message came in. He was often awake at 2. He had been reviewing a proposal from his acquisitions team about a property in Chicago, and he had set it aside when his phone buzzed, and then not gone back to it for 20 minutes, which was unusual for him. He had looked up Maggie Calloway in his employee records because he was a precise person, and he wanted to know exactly who he was talking to. 3 years and 2 months at the Sunside Diner. Positive performance notes. Reliable, excellent customer reviews. No incidents. She had also been, before the diner, a part-time bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, which was noted on her original application. She had some college. 2 years at CUNY before she stopped, which the record did not explain. None of this was why he was awake. He was used to the human cost of business decisions. He had made his peace with a long time ago, in the way that you had to if you were going to function in this industry, and he had done so by being as thorough as possible on the structural end. Fair compensation, legal compliance, adequate notice, and accepting that this was the best that business could be, that it was not personal, that the alternative was paralysis. What was keeping him awake was the image of the pregnancy test on his phone screen. 2 pink lines. And the message, I don't know what to do. He had sent his response to James before he went to sleep. Prepare individual supplemental severance packages for 3 Sunside Diner employees named Patrice, Gerald, and Maria. He would need the details, years of service, current bills if they would share them, family situations. He wanted it done properly. James would be confused by this in the morning. That was fine. He arrived at the office. He had a full day. He went through it. At 5:15, he texted Maggie. Still good for night? She responded, I said dinner, not that I knew where. He typed the name of a restaurant. She was quiet for a moment, and then, that's a $200 plate restaurant. I'm coming in my work clothes because I don't have anything else. Fair warning. He typed back, I'll let them know. She almost did not go. She stood in front of her closet at 6 o'clock that evening and looked at her options, which were limited. She had a black blouse she wore for job interviews. She had dark jeans. She had clean shoes. She put these things on and looked at herself in the mirror and thought, this is a ridiculous situation. She thought about the pregnancy test in her jacket pocket. She had been carrying it with her since the gas station bathroom, which she knew was strange but could not stop doing. She thought about Kevin, who still had not called. She thought about Patrice and Gerald and Maria and the conditions she had laid down in the text last night. She went. The restaurant was on the Upper East Side, the kind of place where the lighting was dim and warm, and the menu had no prices, and the staff had a particular kind of professional friendliness that communicated, I am paid to make you comfortable, and I am very good at my job. The maitre d', she was pretty sure that was what he was called, greeted her by name when she walked in, which startled her. She had clearly been described in advance. Marcus Cole was already there. She recognized him from a photo she had found online, though in person he was taller, maybe, or that the photos had not fully communicated the way he carried himself, which was an economy of movement that suggested someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste anything. He stood when she came to the table, which surprised her. She sat down. He sat down. A waiter appeared and disappeared. She looked at the menu and thought, I could eat for a month on this. He said, you look like you're calculating the menu. She said, I am. He said, order whatever you want. She said, I know. That's not the point. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. Not offended. Something else. She said, Patrice, Gerald, Maria, you said you'd address it. Have you? He said, my assistant is reaching out to each of them tomorrow with revised packages. I'd like to speak with each of them personally, if they're willing. Patrice's situation in particular. 11 years is not a 2-week arrangement. I should have caught that. She looked at him. She was trying to decide if this was a performance or if it was real. She was good at reading people. 3 years of waitressing had given her a fine-tuned sense of who was genuine and who was managing an impression, and she looked at him carefully and could not entirely tell. She said, why does it matter to you? He said, it's the right thing. She said, that's not what I asked. Why does it matter to you personally? You have a team that handles this. You could have had someone from HR call me and offered a check and called it done. Why are you here? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, honestly, I don't entirely know. That was, she thought, either the most disarming, honest answer or the most carefully calibrated, disarming, honest answer she had ever received from someone. She could not tell which. She ordered the salmon. He ordered the steak. They talked. She had not expected this, had braced herself for corporate, for manage, for the practiced warmth of someone who dealt with people as variables. It was something else. He was direct. He was not warm, exactly, but he was present in a way that felt like respect, like she had his actual attention, and not a performance of it. When she said something he did not agree with, he said so, plainly, without softening it. She found she preferred that to the alternative. She told him about the diner, about the regulars, about Mr. Fitch and his $4 Tuesday tips. She did not know why she was telling him this, except that he asked, and the asking seemed real. He asked about before the diner. She told him about the bookkeeping job. About CUNY, briefly. He did not push on the brief. She did not tell him about the pregnancy. She was not going to tell him about the pregnancy. That was not why she was here. At the end of the meal, she said, you should know that I don't think this makes it right. What happened to those people? What happened to me? A nice severance and a dinner doesn't rebuild something that took 11 years. He said, I know. She said, do you? He said, I do. And I don't know how to fix that. I can fix the financial part. The rest of it, I know that's not something that gets fixed. She looked at him. He looked back. There was a long moment of something she did not have a name for. She said, okay. He said, what does okay mean? She said, it means I believe you. I don't know why I believe you, but I do. She left first. She stood on the sidewalk in the October dark and took a long breath and thought, what on earth was that? Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Him. Thank you for coming. I'd like to continue this conversation. She stood there for a moment. Then she typed back, why? And then she got into the cab she had called and went home and did not look at her phone for the rest of the night. He texted back the next morning. Not that night. He waited until morning, which he registered without knowing what to do with. Because I think you are one of the most honest people I've spoken to in years. And that is not something I encounter often. She read this on the bus, on the way to her second follow-up job application. She put her phone in her pocket and looked out the window and thought about it. He was not saying it like a compliment designed to get something. He was saying it the way he said everything, plainly, without decoration, like a fact he was simply reporting. She typed back, that's a sad thing to say about your life. He responded, I know. Then, how are you doing? With everything. She knew what everything meant. The pregnancy test. The thing he had seen by accident, and she had spent 3 days pretending did not exist between them. She typed, managing. He said, that's not the same as okay. She did not respond to that. 2 days later, he texted again. A question about the diner. Specifically about what she would do differently if she were running a business like that. She found herself writing a long response, longer than she intended, about the regulars in the community it served and the fact that the block had 12-hour foot traffic and a lunch rush that the previous design had never fully capitalized on. He asked a follow-up question. Then another. It turned into an hour-long exchange that she conducted from her kitchen while making dinner. Pasta, careful budget math, good olive oil, which she considered non-negotiable. And when she put her phone down, she realized she had laughed twice during the conversation, actually laughed, and could not entirely account for that. He called her the next day. Not a text, a call. She stared at her phone when it rang, at his name on the screen. For 3 full rings before answering, he said, is this okay? She said, calling? Yes. How do you even have my number for a voice call? He said, I dial from the text thread. She said, right, obviously. He said, I wanted to hear your voice. It's harder to tell if someone means something in a text. She thought about that. Then she said, what did you want to find out if I meant? He said, whether you were actually managing or just saying it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have an appointment tomorrow. He said, for the pregnancy. She said, for information, to understand my options. He said, do you have someone to go with you? She almost said yes, reflexively, the way she said she was managing. Then she stopped. Then she said, no. He said, I could come. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, that is the strangest thing anyone has ever offered me. He said, I know. Do you want me to? She thought about sitting in the waiting room alone. She thought about coming home alone after. She thought about the fact that she had been alone through most of the last 3 years, in all the ways that mattered, and had managed just fine, and this was no different. She said, no, but thank you. He said, call me after. She said, I might. She did. The appointment was at a women's health clinic on the west side. The doctor was calm and practical, and kind in a way that medical professionals learn to be when they're doing important work, without drama. Maggie sat in the paper-covered chair and answered questions and had an ultrasound and was told she was approximately 6.5 weeks along. She was given materials about all her options. She was told there was no pressure and no wrong answer and to take her time. She sat in the waiting room for a while afterward, alone on a plastic chair with a pamphlet in her hands, the kind of overwhelm that does not look like anything from the outside. She called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. She said, it was fine. The appointment was fine. They were kind. He said, good. She said, 6.5 weeks. He said nothing. She thought she heard him let out a slow breath. She said, I don't know what I'm going to do yet. He said, you don't have to know yet. She said, I have no job. I have $14,000 of hospital debt. I'm 29 years old, and I live alone in New York, and I'm... She stopped. She had been about to say something she had not said out loud to anyone, not even Danny. She said, I'm scared. He said, I know. She said, you don't know me well enough to know that. He said, I know it because I'd be scared too. And you are someone who doesn't scare easily, which means if you're saying it, it's real. She sat there on the plastic chair and pressed her hand flat against her stomach. Just for a second, just to feel something solid. She said, "I'll figure out." He said, "I know you will." She said, "Why do you keep saying things like that?" He said, "Because they're true." She went home and made tea and sat by her window and thought about Kevin, who had finally texted back asking to meet on Saturday, and about Marcus, who was a stranger who made her feel less alone in a way she was not supposed to feel about a stranger, and about the small collection of cells that were 6.5 weeks old and had, without anyone's permission, changed the entire shape of her life. Saturday came. She met Kevin at a coffee shop on 23rd Street that he had chosen, which was near his apartment, which was intentional whether he knew it was or not. Kevin was 33, good-looking in an unchallenging way, worked in finance, had the confidence of a man who had never really been told no about anything important. He smiled when he saw her, and said she looked great, and hugged her, and she felt absolutely nothing. She told him, straightforward, no preamble. She was pregnant, approximately 6 weeks. She wanted him to know. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if she was sure it was his. She looked at him for a moment with a steadiness that she was proud of later and said yes. Then he asked if she had considered her options, and she said she was considering all of them. Then he said he wanted to be honest with her, which she recognized as a prelude to something she was not going to like. He said he cared about her, but it had been clear that he was not in a place for something serious, and while he would of course support whatever she decided financially if that was the appropriate thing, he did not think he was in a position to be involved in a parenting capacity. She looked at him across the table. He was folding and unfolding the sleeve of his cup. He would not quite meet her eyes. She thought about the crack in her ceiling. She thought about her mother. She thought about Patrice sitting in the empty diner with a legal pad. She thought about the doctor at the clinic, who had been calm and kind without drama. She thought about sitting on a plastic chair pressing her hand flat against her stomach. She said, "Okay. Thank you for being honest." He looked surprised. He had expected something else. She could tell, crying, maybe, or arguing, or needing something from him. She did not need anything from him. She had known that before she sat down. She left the coffee shop and walked 14 blocks in the October cold, not because it was the fastest way home, but because she needed to move. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus, how are you?" She looked at the message. Then she typed, "I told him." A pause. Then, "How did that go?" She typed, "About as expected. He was kind, I suppose, in the way people are when they want to be let off the hook." He responded, "I'm sorry." She typed, "Don't be. I knew before I went. I just needed to know he would confirm it." He typed, "What will you do?" She stood on the corner of 7th and 28th and looked up at the gray sky and thought about that question with the specific focus of someone who's been not thinking about it for 2 weeks and has reached the end of the not thinking. She typed, "I'ma keep it." She had not said that to anyone. Not to Danny. Not to the doctor. Not to herself. Out loud. She sent it and started walking again. Her phone buzzed. His message was 2 words. "Good. Okay." She read that twice. Then a third time. Then she laughed briefly, in a way that surprised her. Not because it was funny exactly, but because there was something in those 2 words that was neither judgment nor pity nor the particular form of congratulation that contained advice, and that absence felt like air. She said, "That's a strange response." He said, "Good, because you clearly already decided." "Okay, because you don't need anything else from me on it right now." She stood on the sidewalk in the October cold and looked at her phone and thought, who is this person? 3 weeks passed. Something developed between them. She was careful with that word, careful not to name it as anything larger than what it was, but it was undeniable that something had developed. They texted every day. They talked on the phone 2 or 3 times a week. She told him things she did not tell other people. Small things, specific things, the way she organized her grocery budget, the particular satisfaction of a table that was genuinely grateful, the way her mother had laughed before the illness. He listened in a way that suggested he was actually listening, not waiting for his turn to speak. He told her things too, though he was slow to offer them, and they came out differently, with more effort, like doors being opened that had been closed a long time. He told her about growing up in the Bronx. He told her about the first apartment building, the one in Wakefield, for units, 3 of which were already occupied when he bought it, tenants who had been there for years. He had made improvements and kept all of them. He said that sometimes he thought about whether he would recognize that version of himself anymore, the one who fixed the boiler himself to save money and knew every tenant by name. She said, "Do you think you would?" He said, "I think you would be suspicious of me," which seems about right. She told him she was nauseous every morning between 6 and 9, and had found that crackers helped, but only specific crackers. The saltine variety pack, not the individual large ones. Something about the size and texture, and this had become the primary focus of her mornings. He had a grocery delivery sent to her apartment. Just saltines, 2 boxes, and ginger ale and a specific prenatal vitamin that she had mentioned in passing and apparently retained. No note, his name on the delivery. She stood at her door holding the bag and thought about whether to call him out on it or say nothing or something in between. She texted, "You sent me crackers." He texted, "You mentioned you were having trouble with the nausea." She said, "I wasn't asking you to fix it." He said, "I know." She said, "This is a weird situation, Marcus." He said, "I'm aware." She said, "I don't know what we're doing." He said, "Neither do I." She said, "That's not reassuring." He said, "It's true, though." She put the crackers in her cabinet and the prenatal vitamins on the counter next to her existing bottle, and thought that having 2 bottles of prenatal vitamins was probably the most specific sign that her life had become genuinely strange. She had gotten a new job by then, not the cafe on 45th, which had never called, but a diner 2 avenues over from the Sunside, a place called Mercer's, less charming but steady. The manager, a man named Al who smelled faintly of cigarettes and was deeply uninterested in small talk, had hired her on the spot when she said 3 years at the Sunside and not 1 complaint. She liked Al for that. No drama, just the work. She had not told Al she was pregnant. She knew she did not have to, not yet. She was barely showing, not at all, really, 9 weeks, just a vague softness that she could see in the mirror because she was looking for it. She tucked it away for later. The morning sickness was manageable if she was careful. The saltines helped. The ginger ale helped. She moved to the breakfast rush with her crackers in her apron pocket and a steadiness that she had built over years of learning that you could feel impossible things and still carry the plates without dropping them. Patrice called her on a Tuesday. Marcus had called Patrice personally, as promised. She had been offered a severance that was significantly better than the original 2 weeks. 3 months of salary continuation plus a recommendation letter and an introduction to a developer friend of Marcus's who was looking for someone to manage a new building restaurant concept on the Lower East Side. Patrice's voice on the phone was complicated, gratitude and something else, something that was not quite the same as forgiveness. She said, "He asked about you. Your old boss." Maggie said, "What do you mean?" Patrice said, "He called to go over the arrangement, and at the end, he asked how you were, whether I thought you were doing all right." Maggie said nothing. Patrice said, "I told him you were always going to be all right, because you're the stubbornest person I've ever known, and I mean that as a compliment." Maggie said, "What did he say?" Patrice said, he said he knew. On a Thursday evening in early November, he asked if he could see her in person, not dinner at a restaurant. He asked if he could come to her neighborhood. She found the specific request notable, not his territory, hers. She said yes. They met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from her apartment. Nothing fancy. The kind of place that had mismatched furniture and a chalkboard menu, and always smelled like burned milk. She was there first. She watched him walk into the window, and thought about how strange it was that he looked completely out of place, and also completely unbothered by being out of place. He sat across from her. He looked tired, she thought, not dramatically, but around the eyes, the specific tired of someone who's been carrying something. She said, "You look tired." He said, "I've been thinking about something, and I'd rather tell you in person." She felt her stomach tighten. She kept her face easy. She said, "Okay." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I grew up about 12 blocks from here." She had not known that. He had mentioned the Bronx, but not specifically where. She said, "From here?" He said, "The building on Amsterdam, the corner one with the green awning. 3rd floor. I lived there until I was 17. Just me and my grandmother after my mother left and my father was not around. She was still. She did not say anything because she could tell he was not done. He said, "There was a diner on 38th Street. I'm not sure if it was the same building. This was 20-something years ago. But there was a diner, and I used to walk past on the way downtown, and every morning there was this woman. I don't know who she was. She used to be at the counter when the morning shift started, and she would look up at the window when people passed. Not at everyone, but sometimes. And once or twice she looked at me and just smiled, not like she knew me, just because I was there." Maggie was listening very carefully. He said, "I bought that block because it made financial sense. That's still true. But I have been thinking about that diner since you texted me, about that woman at the counter, about whether she might have been a regular there for 30 years and never knew her building had been sold until someone walked in with a clipboard." Maggie said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because I think I made a decision when I was 19 years old that I was never going to be the person something happened to. I was always going to be the person making the decision. And I have held to that for 20 years and built everything I have from it. And I think somewhere in that I forgot that the decisions I make happen to real people, not numbers, not employees, people who look up when someone walks past." She looked at him across the small coffee shop table. The chalkboard behind him listed the specials in careful letters. The espresso machine hissed. Someone's phone played a ringtone briefly. She said, "Marcus." He said, "Yeah." She said, "That was a real thing you just said." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm still not entirely sure what to do with you." He said, very quietly, "Neither am I with myself. They stayed for another hour. They talked about nothing important. She told him about a regular at Mercer's who reminded her of Mr. Fitch. Same $4 tip energy, different day. He told her about a building in the South Bronx that he had just declined to purchase, which had surprised his team. She asked why he had declined, and he said because there was a community garden on a lot adjacent, and he did not want to be responsible for it being paved over. And it was the first time in a long time he had made a decision for a reason that was not entirely financial. She said, "Your investors must love that." He said, "They don't know yet." She laughed. A real one. He watched her laugh with an expression she almost missed. Gone fast, carefully replaced, but she saw it. Something open. Something that did not have control over it, that he put over other things. She walked home alone. 3 blocks in the November cold. She called Danny. She said, "I think I might be in trouble." Danny said, "Tell me everything." 2 days later was when it happened. The thing with the coffee. She was working the morning shift at Mercer's. It was a Wednesday, which was a slower day, and she had been on since 6, moving to the tables efficiently, taking orders, refilling cups, doing the small, precise work she was good at. The nausea had been better the last few days. 10 weeks along now, and she had read that for many people the first trimester symptoms ease around this point, which she was choosing to believe was true and not hope. She was behind the counter, refilling the coffee station, when the door opened. She did not look up immediately. She heard the sound of the door, registered the cold air, heard Ailes grunt from the back that served as his version of a greeting. Then she looked up. Marcus Cole, wearing a suit, no tie, which she noted was unusual from the photos she had seen, standing in the doorway of a diner that cost $14 for the full breakfast special, looking around the room with a particular expression of someone who has walked into the right place. She stopped what she was doing. She held the coffee pot. She said, "What are you doing here?" He walked to the counter and sat down on one of the stools. He said, "I wanted to see where you work." She said, "You could have texted." He said, "I know." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Coffee?" He said, "Please." She poured it. He wrapped his hands around the mug. They were sitting about 2 feet apart across the counter, and she was suddenly very aware of how she looked. Apron, ponytail, stained yellow at the hem, and then immediately annoyed at herself for being aware of it. She said, "You came all the way to a diner in my neighborhood on a Wednesday morning to," he said, "to have coffee." She said, "Marcus." He said, "And to ask you something." She waited. He said, "I want to offer you a position." She set the coffee pot down. She said, "What kind of position?" He said, I've been working with a development partner on a mixed-use project on the Lower East Side. The ground floor space was going to be retail. I've been rethinking that. I think there's an opportunity for a community-focused food and beverage concept. Something that actually serves the neighborhood, not just the incoming residents. I want someone to help develop and run it. Someone who understands what those spaces actually mean to people. She looked at him. He said, "You understand it better than anyone on my team. You know the regulars. You know the rhythm. You know what it's like when a place is built for people instead of for a revenue line." She said, "I'm a waitress, Marcus. I have 2 years of college and 3 years of carrying plates." He said, "You also spent 2 years as a bookkeeper, and you rebuilt your entire grocery budget from scratch when you lost your income, and you described to me in accurate detail what the Sunside's foot traffic patterns should have been optimized for in a way that was frankly better than my commercial real estate team's assessment. Don't undersell yourself." She was quiet for a moment. He said, "There's a salary. A good one. Benefits, which you need. The work is the kind of work I think you're suited for." She said, "And what do you get?" He said, "A better project. A better outcome for the neighborhood. Someone I trust to tell me the truth." She looked at him. There was again that word. Someone who told him the truth. It kept surfacing. She said, quietly, "Are you doing this because of the pregnancy?" He said, "No, I'm doing it because you're qualified, and I think you're right for it. The pregnancy is something I'd like to talk about separately if you're open to that. But they're not the same conversation." She picked up the coffee pot. She held it. She said, "I need to think about it." He said, "Of course." She said, "And I need you to know that if I take it, I'm not taking it because you feel bad about the diner or because of anything else. I'm taking it because it's a good opportunity on its own." He said, "I know. That's why I'm asking." There was a moment, quiet between them. The diner made its morning sounds around them. The hiss of the flat top, Gerald's diner equivalent working the back, the door opening and letting in cold air. Then the door opened again. She looked up. A woman in a very expensive coat walked in, looked around, and spotted Marcus. Walked directly to him with the specific confidence of someone who is never unsure where she is going. She was maybe 45, blonde, the kind of put together that took both money and significant effort. She looked at Marcus and then at Maggie with the same expression. 2 quick, complete assessments. She said to Marcus, "Your driver said you came in here. I've been waiting 20 minutes. We have the Carlisle breakfast at 8:30. Marcus said, "I know. I'll meet you there." The woman looked at Maggie again, then back at Marcus. Then she said, with a smile that did not include warmth, "Is this a new acquisition?" Silence. Maggie held the coffee pot. Marcus said, "This is Maggie Calloway. She's someone I'm working with on the Lower East Side project. Maggie, this is Diana Voss. We work together on certain projects." Diana said, "Charmed." She did not look charmed. She looked at Maggie with a very specific kind of consideration, the kind that was a full analysis being performed in real time, and then she looked back at Marcus and said, "Don't be late." Then she left. The door swung shut. Maggie set the coffee pot down very carefully. She said, "Who is she?" He said, "Someone I used to be involved with. Briefly. It was a long time ago." She said, "How long ago?" He said, 3 years. We still work together occasionally. It's complicated." She looked at him. She said, "I see." He said, "Maggie?" She said, "What exactly were you going to say to me today? Before you offer me a job, what was the other conversation? The one that was separate?" He was quiet. She said, "Because I need you to know that I am 10 weeks pregnant, and I have been alone in this the entire time, and I have managed. I am managing. I don't need to be a project. Marcus, I don't need someone to feel responsible for me because they accidentally saw a photo on their phone. I need things to be real." He said, "They are real." She said, "Are they?" "Because that woman just walked in here and looked at me like I was something you were collecting, and you introduced me as someone you're working with, and I need to understand which version of this is true." He said, "Both, and neither is the whole truth, and I know that's not a satisfying answer." She picked up the coffee pot. She said, "Name your price. That's what you were going to say, wasn't it, when you came in here, before you rethought it into a job offer? Name your price. He was very still. She said, That's what men like you do, isn't it? You find the equation that makes the uncomfortable thing manageable. Name your price. Fix the inconvenience. Write the check. Go back to the Carlisle. He said, That's not. She said, Is it not? He looked at her. Something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. Not offense. Not calculation. Something raw. Something that had been under the controlled surface the whole time. He said, I came here because I have been thinking about you every day for 3 weeks, and I do not know what to do with that. Silence. She looked at him. He said, And yes, I have a team and a company and a deal to manage and a breakfast at the Carlisle, and my life does not have a space in it for something I don't know how to categorize. I know that, but I keep... He stopped. She said, Keep what? He said, I keep thinking about you on the bench in the park. The day you told me you were keeping it. You were alone and it was cold, and you texted me the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me in a decade of doing business with very careful people, and I don't know what that means. I just know it means something. The coffee pot was still in her hand. She looked at him for a long, long moment. Then she poured the coffee over his head. Not gently, not symbolically. Full, hot, black, straight from the pot, directly on the head of a man worth $4.7 billion, right there in the middle of Mercer's Diner on a Wednesday morning in November. The whole room went silent. Every fork stopped. Every conversation died. Gerald leaned through the pickup window. Marcus Cole sat there, dripping, and did not move. Maggie set the empty coffee pot down on the counter. Her hand was shaking. Her eyes were not. She said very quietly, If you want to have a real conversation, you come back when you figured out what you actually want. Not a job offer. Not a price. The real thing. Then she picked up her order pad and went back to work. He left. He did not say anything else. He walked out of Mercer's Diner dripping coffee and got into his car and sat there for a moment and then told his driver to take him to the Carlisle. Diana was waiting in the lobby. She looked at him, his suit, the coffee stain, the particular expression on his face, and she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, She's the one. He said, Don't. She said, I'm not being cruel. I'm telling you what I see. He said, Diana. She said, I know you better than anyone still functioning in your life. Marcus. I watched you spend 3 years making everything in your life exactly as controlled and efficient as possible. And I am looking at you right now, and you are sitting in a hotel lobby with coffee in your hair, and you look more alive than I have seen you in 3 years. He said nothing. She said, I'm not what you need. I never was. We both knew that. Go figure out what you actually want. She stood up and walked to the elevator and left him sitting there. He did not go back to Mercer's the next day, or the day after that. He did not text for 3 days. Maggie worked her shifts and came home, and made dinner, and talked to Danny, and did not check her phone. She checked her phone constantly. She told herself she was not waiting for anything, and she was undeniably waiting. On the 3rd day, his name appeared on her screen. Not a text, a call. She let it ring twice. Then she answered. He said, I know you said come back when I'd figured it out. She said, Have you? He said, Some of it. She said, Tell me the part you figured out. He said, I want to be involved. Not as a fixer. Not as someone with resources managing a situation. I want to be present in whatever way you'll let me. I don't know how to do that. I have not been present for another person in a very long time, but I want to learn. She sat down. She was in her kitchen, still in her coat from the bus home. She said, That's not all the parts. He said, No. She said, What's the other part? A long pause. Then he said, The baby scares me. Not in the way you might think. I'm not afraid of the responsibility. I'm afraid of... I grew up without a father. I became exactly the kind of man I swore I would not become, the kind who can write a check from a distance and call it involvement. And I am afraid that that is all I know how to be. She was quiet. He said, I don't know if I know how to stay. She said, very gently, That was the most honest thing you've ever said to me. He said, It felt like something I owed you. She said, Marcus. He said, Yeah. She said, You drove to a diner in your best suit at 7 in the morning to have bad coffee and see where I work. You sent me saltines. You called Patrice yourself. You turned down a property because of a community garden. I don't think you're as far gone as you think you are." He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that she recognized after a moment as a laugh, low and brief and startled. He said, "That's a strange case you're making for me." She said, "I'm not making a case. I'm telling you what I see." He said, "You sound like someone I know." She said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Diana told me something similar 3 days ago." She said, "Diana." He said, "Is gone. We ended it. The working relationship. She ended it, actually." She said, "Never mind." Maggie said, "Say it." He said, "She said you were the one. I told her not to say that. But she said it, and she was not wrong." The kitchen was very quiet. Maggie looked at her hands. She thought about the crack in the ceiling. She thought about the gas station bathroom. She thought about the pregnancy test sitting in a box in her drawer, where she had finally put instead of her pocket a small act of permanence. She said, "Come for dinner." He said, "When?" She said, "Saturday. Nothing fancy. I'm not cooking anything I can't afford." He said, "I'll bring wine." She said, "Ginger ale." He said, "Right, ginger ale." He showed up Saturday with ginger ale and a very specific kind of expensive cheese that he said went with crackers, and she recognized the call back and was briefly grateful that she could turn away to open the fridge so he could not see her face. They ate pasta at her small kitchen table. She had made enough sauce from a recipe her mother used to make, garlic and crushed tomato, and a long slow cook that made the whole apartment smell good, the smell of something being taken care of. He said, "This is incredible." She said, "It's $20 pasta." He said, "That's not what I mean." She looked at him across the table. She said, "I know. They talked for 4 hours. Everything and nothing. His grandmother, her mother, the way they had both learned to be the person who handled things for other people before they learned to need things for themselves." She told him a thing about her mother she had not told him yet, that she had passed 2 years ago, that the hospital bills were the final chapter of a 3-year illness, that Maggie had been with her at the end, that she still sometimes reached for her phone to call her and then remembered. He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "She would have liked you. She had a thing for people who were more complicated than they looked." He said, "Is that how I look?" She said, "You look like someone who built a wall and forgot to leave a door. But the door is there. I can see it." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I don't usually let people look that hard." She said, "I know. You didn't this time either. I just looked anyway." Later, standing at the door when he was leaving, the November cold coming in from the hallway, she said, "This is real, right?" "I need it to be real." He said, "It is." She said, "Because I have a list of things I cannot afford and a crack in my ceiling, and I'm 11 weeks pregnant, and I do not have room in my life for something that is not real." He said, "Maggie." She said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm terrified." She said, "Me too." He said, "Good. I think that means it's real." She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the door a little wider and said, "I'll see you soon." He said, "Yes, you will." He went down the stairs, and she closed the door and stood in her kitchen and pressed her hand flat on her stomach the way she had in the clinic waiting room and thought, okay. It did not become simple. Love. If that was what this was becoming, and she was careful with the word, she did not use it casually. Love did not make the complicated things simple. That was a lie. The complicated things stayed complicated. There was a money problem, which she handled by being exactly herself about it. She did not take from him. She took the job, because it was a real job with a real salary that she had earned on real merit. And she negotiated her own terms and had a friend who was a paralegal look over the contract. She kept her apartment. She told him specifically and directly that she needed to remain financially independent during whatever this was, that her entire sense of herself depended on that. And he said he understood, and she tested whether he understood by waiting to see if he would try to help anyway. He did not try to help anyway. He understood. There was the Kevin problem, which resolved itself in a way she had not entirely expected. Kevin called in late November, 3 weeks after their coffee shop meeting. He had been thinking, he said. He had talked to a lawyer, which she found bracing but also fair. He wanted to know what she needed. She said what she needed was for him to decide, clearly and completely, whether he wanted to be in this child's life or not. And whatever he decided, she would handle the legal paperwork accordingly. And she had no interest in forcing involvement from someone who did not genuinely want to give it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he did not think he was the right person for this. He said it quietly, without the self-justifying around him from the coffee shop, just plainly and sadly, which she respected even as it made her sad too. She said okay. She started the paperwork for establishing paternity and support arrangements through a lawyer she found through legal aid, an enormously practical woman named Claudette, who had handled 1,000 versions of the situation and approached each one with the same focused competence Maggie found deeply reassuring. She told Marcus about Kevin's decision on a Tuesday night on the phone. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "His loss," and the way he said it, not dramatic, just flat and certain, made her eyes sting in a way she had not expected. There was the work problem, which she solved by being extremely good at her job. She had started in the Lower East Side project in an advisory capacity while still working shifts at Mercer's, because she was not going to be financially dependent on a single income source, especially one connected to Marcus, until she was certain it was stable. She met with the development team and told them directly what she thought needed to change about their ground floor concept and why. And she was right, which the numbers eventually confirmed. And she kept being right, and Al at Mercer's gave her a reference that was so straightforwardly complimentary, she had to read it twice to make sure it was about her. There was a health problem, which was not really a problem, but required management. 12 weeks. 15 weeks. She was showing now a small, unmistakable curve. She told Al. He said, "Congrats. Do you need different shift hours? What do you need?" She said, "I need the same shift for now, and I'll tell you when that changes." He said, "Fine," and went back to the kitchen, and that was that, which was exactly the amount of drama she wanted. She went to her prenatal appointments. She started them with Danny on the phone in the waiting room beforehand, which became a ritual. She went to one in early December, and Marcus asked if he could come, and she let him. He sat next to her in the waiting room with a rigidity that she recognized, after a moment, as nerves, the specific stiffness of someone trying not to show something. She was surprised. She said, "Are you nervous?" He said, "I've never been to one of these before." She said, "What did you think it was like?" He said, "I didn't know what to think." The appointment was routine. The doctor was warm and practical. There was an ultrasound. There was a small blurry form on the screen with a heartbeat that the doctor narrated in clinical terms, and Maggie watched in a particular stunned silence that she had felt every time. She looked at Marcus. He was looking at the screen with an expression she had never seen on him before, open in a way that had nothing calculated in it, nothing controlled. Just a raw face of someone encountering something they were not prepared for. He said nothing on the drive back. She did not try to fill the silence. She understood it. When the car stopped at her block, he said, "Thank you for letting me come." She said, "Yeah." He said, "She's real." She said, "You don't know it's a she." He said, "I know. She's real anyway." She got out of the car and went inside and stood in her apartment and pressed her hand on her stomach and thought, "We're going to be okay." December arrived. Then Christmas. Then the new year. She was 20 weeks in January. Halfway, the anatomy scan confirmed everything was healthy, and he had been right. It turned out a girl. She told him on the phone, not in person, because she wanted to hear his voice. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew it." She said, "You did not know it." He said, "I knew it." She said, "Marcus." He said, "I have a name if you want it. I've been thinking about names. You don't have to use it. I know it's your decision. I just want to offer it." She said, "Okay, what is it?" He said, "Ruth." She was quiet. Her grandmother's name. He had not known that. She had mentioned her grandmother exactly once. Briefly. The first week. The woman at the counter at the diner on 38th Street. The one who had smiled at him when he was 17. And Maggie had said in passing that her grandmother had been a woman who made everyone around her feel seen. She said, carefully, "How did you land on Ruth?" He said, "It means companion, and it means the person who stays." She could not speak for a moment. He said, Was that the wrong thing to say?" She said, "No, it's not the wrong thing." He said, "Maggie." She said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm staying." She said, "I know. It did not look like movies." She wanted to be clear about that, even to herself. It did not look like the version in the stories, not the sweep and the grand gesture and the music swelling moment where everything was resolved. It looked like this. It looked like him learning to text about small things. He had been, at first, someone who only texted with purpose. Specific information, questions, logistics. Over the months, he started texting other things. A photo from a window of the 42nd floor, the city lit up at dusk, a note about something he had read that reminded him of something she had said. One day, in February, a photo of a box of specific saltine crackers at a deli near his office with the message. They had them. She said she no longer needed them for nausea. He said he knew, he just saw them. It looked like her learning to let someone help. This was harder. She was 30 years old in February, a birthday she told almost no one about, and he found out from Danny. He had called Danny, which Maggie discovered and was briefly furious about, and then not, because the reason he had called Danny was to ask what she actually wanted for her birthday, not what she would say she wanted, but what she actually wanted. Danny had told him about their mother's lasagna recipe, which had been lost. Their mother had kept it in her head and never written it down, and both girls had been trying to recreate it for 2 years. He had found a culinary historian. She did not know such a thing was a job, but apparently it was. He had described everything Maggie and Danny could remember, the specific sweetness, the particular texture of the bechamel, the herbs, the fact that their mother had always used one specific brand of tomato that she had bought at a specific grocery store in their neighborhood in Queens. On her birthday, he handed her a folded piece of paper with a recipe on it, precise and annotated, with a note at the bottom that said, "It won't be exactly hers, but this is as close as anyone could get." She cried. She tried not to, and she cried anyway, which she hated and also needed, and he sat there and did not say anything useful, which was exactly right. She said, "How did you even—" He said, "You told me you still reach for your phone to call her. I thought maybe if you had the recipe, you'd have something to hold on to." She said, "That is the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done for me." He said, "I had help." Danny was very specific about the tomato brand. She laughed through the tears, which was the best kind of laughing. He watched her, and his face did the thing it sometimes did when he thought she was not looking, open and unguarded, and full of something he still did not entirely know how to say out loud, but was learning. It looked like them fighting. They fought. She wanted to be honest about this. She was direct, and he was controlled, and those two things collided regularly. She would say something real, and he would respond with something managed, and she would call what it was, and he would go quiet, and then come back differently, which over time she recognized as his version of yielding, the specific silence of someone who was learning that yielding was not losing. She was not easy. She knew that. She had opinions about everything, and she stated them, and she did not soften them for comfort. He found this. She could see it. Both difficult and genuinely something he had not had in his life and needed. She thought sometimes that he had surrounded himself with people who agreed with him, or at least agreed professionally, and that he had mistaken that for competence instead of loneliness. She said this to him once. He said, after a long moment, "That's probably the most uncomfortable, accurate thing anyone has said to me." She said, "Good. Now do something about it." He did, gradually. The people around him shifted slightly. He hired a woman for his core team who disagreed with him in a board meeting on record, and he told her afterward that she was right. He called Patrice, months after their initial conversation, not for business reasons, but just to hear how she was doing. She had taken a restaurant manager job and was, Maggie knew from their regular calls, building something good. It looked like being afraid and staying anyway. There was a night in March when she was 8 months along and everything was close, and she lay awake with the weight of the pregnancy and the weight of everything she had built in the last 6 months and the weight of everything she was about to become responsible for. And she reached for her phone and texted him, "I'm scared again." He called in 30 seconds. He stayed on the phone with her for 2 hours. He talked about his grandmother, who had raised him from the time he was 8 and who had been, he said, the single most important person in his life, who had died when he was 26, which was the year he bought the building in Wakefield. He said he'd been holding her in his mind every time he made a decision since then, asking silently what she would think. He said he thought about her when he looked at the ultrasound screen. He said he thought she would have liked Maggie enormously, which he said with a specific conviction of someone who knew exactly what they meant. She said, she would have told you to stop being so controlled. He said, she did, constantly. She used to say, boy, what are you so afraid of? It's just life. She said, smart woman. He said, the smartest. She said, I feel better. He said, good. Go to sleep. She said, Marcus. He said, yeah. She said, I love you. A pause. Not a long one. But there. He said, I know. She said, that's a terrible response. He said, I know that too. She said, say it. He said, I love you. I've loved you since you threw coffee at me. I think, which is either a great story or a concerning one. She said, it's a great story. He said, yeah, it is. Ruth Eleanor Calloway was born on a Tuesday in April at 11:17 in the morning. 7 pounds 4 ounces. Dark hair, which surprised nobody. Eyes that the nurses said would likely change, but which at that moment were a deep, unfocused blue. Maggie had been in labor for 14 hours. She had called Marcus when the contractions were 20 minutes apart, and he had been at the hospital in 40 minutes, which she would tease him about later. She was pretty sure he broke traffic laws, which he did not confirm or deny. He stayed. The whole time. He sat in the chair by the bed, and he held her hand to the parts that were hard, and he said nothing useful during them, which was what she had asked for, not reassurance, not information, just presence, just the weight of his hand in hers. He did that. He was good at that. When Ruth arrived, when Maggie heard the specific first sound that she had been told about but was still not prepared for, the furious, startled cry of a new person encountering air, she felt something she did not have a name for. The books talked about immediate, overwhelming love. What she felt was more complicated than that, more like recognition, like meeting someone she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting. The nurse placed Ruth on her chest. She was so small. This was the thing nobody told you adequately. How small? Maggie had known the statistics. 7 pounds 4 ounces. But knowing and holding were completely different information. She was so small and so complete, and so utterly herself, scrunching her face against the light, one fist already curled tight. Maggie looked up. Marcus was standing at the edge of the bed with an expression she had never seen and would not see again in quite that specific way. Something that had no control in it at all. His jaw was tight and his eyes were bright, and he was looking at the two of them, at Maggie and Ruth together, with the face of a man who has spent 20 years deciding what things were worth and has just encountered something he cannot price. She said, come here. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at Ruth for a long moment. She was still crying, the furious, righteous crying of the newly arrived. He reached out and touched her hand, one finger, careful, against her curled fist. Ruth's fist opened and closed around his finger. He made a sound she had not heard before. Low, barely there. She said, you okay? He did not answer for a moment. Then he said, yeah. She looked at him. He was not okay in the way you are not okay when something cracks you open in the best possible way. She looked at him holding his finger in Ruth's fist and thought about the boy on the streets of the Bronx who had walked past a diner and had a woman at the counter smile at him just because he was there, who had decided at 17 that he was never going to be the person something happened to. He was the person something was happening to right now, in the best way, and he was not running from it. She said, we're going to be okay. He said, I know. She said, you don't have to know. You can be scared. He said, I know that too. I'm both. She looked down at Ruth, who had stopped crying, and was now doing the specific thing of extremely new people where she was looking in the direction of something that she could not quite see, learning the light. Ruth, companion, the person who stays. 5 years later. It was a Sunday morning in October, which was the best kind of morning. Maggie knew this because she had learned to notice the best kinds of mornings, which was something she had not always been good at, but had gotten better at over time. She was in the kitchen making coffee. The good kind. They had the machine now. The one that cost too much, which she had accepted on the specific condition that she also kept her old dented pot from her apartment because she was not ready to lose it. Both lived on the counter. She used both, depending on the morning. The apartment was theirs now. His building, originally, which she had eventually moved into after a set of very specific negotiations that she had conducted herself, without a lawyer, and which had resulted in conditions she was satisfied with. It had a view of the park. It had high ceilings. It had, in the kitchen, a shelf with a framed recipe on it. A piece of paper in her mother's handwriting, which Maggie had written from memory after the culinary historian's version, helped her reconstruct the original, a document that existed somewhere between the past and the present. From the hallway came the sound of small feet at speed. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway. For years old, dark hair, always messy, eyes that had, as predicted, changed, brown now. The specific warm dark brown that she'd gotten from Maggie's mother, which was something Maggie thought about sometimes with a quiet gratitude that did not have words. She said, "Mama, Daddy says he can't find my shoe." Maggie said, "Which shoe?" Ruth said, "The sparkly one." This was a recurring situation. The sparkly shoe had a tendency to be found in locations that defied logic. The bathroom cabinet once, the bookcase, once inexplicably the refrigerator, which nobody had ever explained. From down the hallway Marcus's voice, "I found it. It was under the radiator." Ruth turned and ran back toward the voice. Maggie heard the collision of small person and large person, the particular laugh that Ruth had when something pleased her enormously, which was often, because she was an enormously pleased person, curious and loud, and opinionated in ways that Marcus called either alarming or magnificent depending on the day. Maggie poured her coffee. She stood at the kitchen window with a view of the park. The October light doing what October light does, golden, slanted, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look kept. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway with Ruth on his back, holding the sparkly shoe. He set Ruth down, and she took the shoe and ran toward her room, satisfied. He went to the counter and poured his own coffee from the expensive machine and stood next to Maggie at the window. She said, "She found a crack in her bedroom wall. She's very interested in it." He said, "Is she?" She said, "I told her cracks were the walls breathing, and now she's considering whether the apartment is alive." He said, "That's going to be a long conversation." She said, "I know." They stood at the window. The park below had that particular Sunday morning quality. Joggers, a dog walker managing 4 dogs, a couple on a bench with coffee cups, a man on the path who had the specific energy of someone who had just decided to start exercising and was regretting it. He said, "Patrice called yesterday. The restaurant is getting a review in the Times." She said, "I know." She texted me. He said, "You knew?" She said, "I knew." He said, "You didn't tell me." She said, "I was enjoying knowing by myself for a little while." He looked at her with the specific expression she had catalogued over the years, the one that was affection organized into something dry, because he was not yet always able to let affection be just affection. She loved this expression. She had been collecting it for 5 years. He said, "How's the Lower East Side project?" She said, "The ground floor is fully committed. We have a small grocery, a coffee shop that is going to be genuinely good, and a communal space that the building residents are already arguing over in the best possible way." He said, "You sound pleased." She said, "I am pleased." He said, "You were right about what it needed to be." She said, "I know." He said, "You could say I was right to hire you." She said, "I could. I probably won't." He laughed. The real one, not the managed one. She had, over time, gotten him to the real laugh more often than not, which she considered one of her genuine accomplishments. From Ruth's room came a sound of determined activity. Construction. By the sound of it, some project that would require explaining later and might involve furniture. Maggie said, "We should check on that." He said, "Probably." She said, "Marcus." He said, "Yeah." She said, "You stayed." He looked at her. She said, "I just want to say out loud sometimes. You stayed." He put his coffee down and turned toward her fully and said, "I told you I would." She said, "I know. I just want to make sure I'm not taken for granted." He said, "You're not." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because you say it out loud." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went up on her toes and kissed him, briefly, the morning kind, the kind that was not a beginning but a middle, which was, she had come to believe, the best kind. From down the hall, Ruth's voice, "I found another crack." Maggie said, pulling back, "I'll handle this." He said, "I'll come." They walked down the hallway together toward the voice of their daughter, who was very interested in the crack in her wall, and had many opinions about whether the apartment had a heartbeat, and the October light came through the windows at the end of the hall, golden and slanted, the kind that makes everything look like it was built to last. Here's what Maggie knew. 5 years after the morning she stood in a gas station bathroom and looked at 2 pink lines on a plastic stick. She knew that the worst moments of your life are not the end of the story. They are the inciting incident, the moment the real story begins. The 2 pink lines, the fire job, the wrong number, the coffee in the face. Every one of those things felt like a wall, and every one of them turned out to be a door. She knew that love was not a transaction. It was not a price named, or a check written, or a job offered from a position of guilt. Love was the 3-day silence followed by the honest call. It was the saltines and the ginger ale and the culinary historian and the finger in the small fist. It was a man who did not know how to stay learning to stay. It was a woman who had always managed learning to let someone help. She knew that her mother was in the recipe on the kitchen shelf. That Patrice was in the restaurant getting reviewed by the Times. That Ruth was the person who stayed, and also the person who had made everyone around her understand that staying was the thing that mattered most. She knew that the crack in her ceiling, the one she had stared at for 11 months on Riverside Avenue in the old apartment, had eventually been repaired. She had called the landlord, finally, in her last month there, not because she had time, but because she had decided that the cracks in your life were worth attending to before you left them behind. And she knew this, that somewhere in the city there was a diner on West 38th Street that no longer existed, replaced now by a building with a community guard on the lot adjacent, and 200 apartments above, and a small grocery on the ground floor with a handwritten sign in the window that said, "Everyone welcome." And in the morning, when the light was right, the woman who worked the coffee station inside would sometimes look up when someone walked past on the sidewalk outside. Not at everyone, but sometimes, just because they were there. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs it tonight. And if you're in the middle of your own worst moment right now, the 2 pink lines, the empty counter, the crack in the ceiling, just remember, that is not the end. That is where the story starts.